Next, a discussion on presidential candidates and Middle East policy issues. Yesterday, the Arab American Institute released a report detailing the positions of the candidates on the Middle East peace process. It's about 45 minutes.
Okay, I will, I think we've caught the guy. Good morning. My name is James Zogby, and I'm president of the Arab American Institute. We have compiled a study which you have available to you on the nature of the policy debate, the state of the policy debate on Middle East issues. During the past 25 years, the United States has sent more troops, sold more weapons, lost more lives, spent more money in foreign aid, and had more national security interests at risk in the Middle East than any other region of the world. At the same time, the unresolved problems that have plagued the region have required significant attention from every U.S. president, from Nixon to Clinton. At the same time, during the more than 2 decades in question, there has been an observable shift in U.S. public attitudes towards the Middle East and a change in the conduct of U.S. Middle East policy as well. The change is most noticeable in public opinion, however, as measured in polls throughout this entire period. What is disturbing, however, is that even with the substantial U.S. involvement in the region, and with the changes in attitudes and some changes in policy, there has been little serious political debate amongst the candidates on critical Middle East issues and virtually no press scrutiny of the positions of the candidates on these issues. In the electoral arena, in too many instances, pandering before some pro-Israel audiences has substituted for serious policy debate. This was especially true before the onset of the current Middle East peace process. There have been changes since then, and I'll get into those in a minute. Compounding this problem has been the failure of the press to challenge candidates on Middle East policy questions. More often than not, when candidates have displayed real ignorance of the Middle East, or when they've espoused dangerous views, or when they've dramatically contradicted their previously held positions, they were given a pass in the press, or cynically and casually dismissed as playing politics as usual. And there are numerous instances of this that I think require some examination. Pat Robertson ran for the presidency, spoke frequently about the Middle East, was never questioned about his views. This is an individual who, in fact, believes, yes, as a supporter of Israel and the ingathering of Jews into that state, but believes in this precisely because he believes ultimately in the conversion of Jews to Christianity, in the onset of a nuclear Armageddon that will destroy the world in order to bring on the Messiah. No one has ever questioned Pat Robertson about these views. If any other candidate or anyone who has raised significant amounts of money for candidates, or any group like the one he heads was so involved in the political process and endorsed candidates and held similar views about any other region of the world, actually believing in, hoping for, calling for a nuclear Armageddon, we would have had some questions. We would have had some reservations. It has been ignored. And so dismissing it as politics as usual is, I think, unacceptable. The lack of scrutiny has resulted in denying voters an opportunity to evaluate the positions of political candidates or the performance of government officials on critical Middle East issues. We lost significant numbers of lives in Lebanon in the 1980s. There was never a discussion about this. When Reagan ran for re-election in 1984, the question about what happened in Lebanon did not occur. Neither have the failures of U.S. policy over the last 3 decades, 4 decades, even in Iran and in Iraq, ever resulted in serious questions about our flip-flopping policy. Who talks about the Shah? Who talks about the human rights problems in Iran that led to the current situation? These issues have never come up. Now, a review of Middle East positions of those who seek the presidency this year suggests a partisan split that can only partly be explained by the fact that the Clinton administration has been in charge of U.S. policy over the last 2 years. There is a role that is played by the Christian right. This has been ignored, or by neoconservative hardliners. This has been ignored as well. There are some differences that now exist with regard to U.S. policy towards Jerusalem and the conduct of policy in the peace process. There is a consensus, however, on policy towards Iraq, but a difference in emphasis, Republicans taking a more hardline stance than Democrats. And these require scrutiny, debate, some examination. With the peace process at a critical stage and with security of important U.S. allies and interests in the Gulf at risk, with the expectation that the U.S. will continue to have significant involvement in the region, critical issues of Middle East policy and the positions of political candidates on these issues must be subjected to greater scrutiny by the press. The Middle East today remains a serious challenge for U.S. policymakers. Significant portions of the peace process remain at a critical impasse, and the standoff with Iraq continues. Both situations are volatile and can erupt at any time into conflict. At the same time, it is important to note that there is a growing alienation from the U.S. that is developing in many sections of Arab public opinion. The persistence of a perceived U.S. double standard in its policy toward the region should be a matter of concern. Those who seek to lead the United States during the next 4 years will, like their predecessors, undoubtedly be consumed by the challenges of the Middle East. It is imperative, therefore, that they be challenged now, during the election, to describe in detail how they will shape Middle East policy to promote peace and to protect U.S. interests in the critical region. Worn-out cliches and pandering and dangerous and provocative posturing will not do. Substantive discussion is needed. The only time so far in this election that the question has occurred in one of the presidential debates was in the recent Republican debate in Michigan. Gary Bauer was asked a rather substantive question by a reporter, how he stood on the peace process, how he stood on a Palestinian state, what he would do to bring the process on track. He responded with a criticism of the administration for putting pressure on Israel and said no more, other than a kind of a posturing, pandering view in a state which really requires a more substantive debate, given to both the presence of an Arab American community and a state that has a significant investment in the Middle East. He was not challenged by the reporter or by those who sat on the podium with him. It is important that the press not let this go, not let this go. If statements as provocative as that were made about China or about Russia, we would have stories about it. If the position, for example, of the Republican candidates with regard to moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem were to have been given on any other foreign policy issue, the press would be examining it. If we let the candidates go, for example, during an appearance before a conservative American Jewish audience, the Republican candidates, one by one, came forth and talked about moving the embassy to Jerusalem the first day they were in office. I mean, the pandering continued to accelerate through the day. One candidate even responded to a trick question and said he'd move the embassy to East Jerusalem if that's what you want. Can you let that go? Should that have been excused as, well, mere pandering on the issue? Of course not. A position as provocative as that, a policy as dangerous as that, should have been challenged, should have been talked about. We can't give these guys a free pass on this stuff. And it happens all too often. It wouldn't happen on another serious foreign policy issue. Shouldn't happen on this one. Now, I want to suggest to you that while the candidates say these things in office, they do very different things. That also should be subject to some level of scrutiny. The same kind of criticisms that Republicans are offering of Democrats today, Democrats frequently offered of Republicans when George Bush was running for re-election in 1992. There has been a consistency in American policy regardless of the administration. Somehow that also needs to be talked about and subjected to scrutiny. We cannot have an area where we have sent so much money, invested so many lives, lost so many lives, have so many troops stationed and so much at risk, and have no serious debate as we go into the next 4 years. And so I leave you with that it is imperative, and the reason why we've done the study is because we feel it is important that as we examine in close detail the policies of individuals as they seek to solve domestic or other foreign policy problems, the same level of scrutiny is required as we look at the candidates' positions with regard to the Middle East. This week, the Clinton administration suffered a setback with regard to its policy toward the Syrian-Israeli track in the peace talks, is going to be spending the week with Barak and Arafat on the Palestinian track, is still working with the United Nations on trying to come up with a monitoring team that will handle the inspections as called for by the most recent Security Council resolution with Iraq, etc. It is an area that consumes the time of U.S. presidents, and therefore ought to be consuming our time as we look at those who will seek to lead the country during the next 4 years. Thank you. I'll take any questions you have. Yes.
Is there any difference that you've been able to discern in the Middle East positions of Bradley and Gore? I haven't really, following in a superficial way, I haven't really been able to catch even a nuance of difference.
The Vice President, because he is the Vice President and has been responsible for U.S. policy, has taken a more developed stance on a number of issues. Of course, he has been intimately involved in Iraq policy, and has also been involved rather closely with the Middle East peace process, and therefore, especially during the last year and a half, has spoken on a number of occasions with regard to both issues before Jewish audiences and Arab audiences. I should add one additional factor here, and I think is worthy of note. When I talk about the change in opinion as a component in helping to bring about a change in the policy debate, there are two factors here that didn't exist 30 years ago. One is the existence of my own community, that Arab Americans are today a political constituency that candidates come and speak to, that candidates seek to win the support of. There's also a debate within the American Jewish community, a significant debate within the American Jewish community over the conduct of U.S. Middle East policy. There are today rather major American Jewish organizations that one would define as being in the peace camp. And there are other American Jewish organizations that are in a position which is not as supportive of the peace process. They find themselves largely supporting some of the Republican positions, whereas a Vice President Gore, for example, has audiences that he can go to address the Middle East from the perspective of someone who is supporting the peace process. And that has had an impact. For example, he has taken a position on Jerusalem that is supportive of the current administration position. He has taken a position with regard to the broader peace process that is equally supportive of the position taken by the president, which I think is interesting, because if you look at some of the speeches given by the Vice President 3 years ago, and look at the more presidential sound of speeches over the last 2 years, people feel a certain comfort today in speaking about the Middle East and looking at the address given to the Middle East by some of the candidates that is far more balanced than one would have seen 2 decades ago. Bradley has not spoken as extensively on the issue, but in the bare outlines takes a similar position with regard, for example, to Jerusalem, with regard to the broader goals of the peace process, and with regard to Iraq. He has taken a very similar position to that of the current administration. Yes.
Your paper talks a lot about the shift to pro-Israel positions by the Republicans, and the vice versa for the Democrats. To what extent do you think this would have an impact on the Arab community and the Arab organizations like yours?
Well, the question remains as to what Republicans will do when they're in office. During the Bush administration, we saw the debate move one way, but we saw the Bush administration move another way within his own party. And I think that that was important to note. I would suggest to you that a Republican president would probably maintain many of the principles in policy that are currently being put in place by the Clinton administration, as they were by the Bush administration that preceded. Actually, in many ways, like I say, the criticisms Republicans are offering of Democrats today are similar to the ones that Democrats offered of Republicans 7 years ago. Too much pressure on Israel, for example. Didn't live up to their promises on Jerusalem, for example. But there is a factor here that I think needs to be noted, which I note in the paper, and that is a difference in the constituency that is involved in both parties. There is today a debate in the Jewish community, and the Jewish community, if you do polling in New York, for example, on the question of a Palestinian state, you find that by 4-to-1 New Yorkers support a Palestinian state. You also find the majority of American Jews in New York support a Palestinian state. There is a change in how American Jews are viewing Middle East questions, and that has not been ignored by candidates, especially Democrats, who seek support from American Jews. But on the Republican side, there is a change as well. When we ask the question, for example, with regard to just one question, I'm just going to look at the cross-tabulations with regard to one question. The question is, with regard to the Middle East, how do you feel the next president should relate to the region? Respondents say pro-Israel, 14%. The next president should be pro-Arab, just 1%. But strike a middle ground between Israel and the Arabs, 77.5%. Now, when you break that out and you look at the cross-tabulations there, Democrats say pro-Israel, 7.5%. But Republicans say that pro-Israel, 22%. Now, why is that the case? When you get inside of that, you find that fully 1/2 of those who say that the next president should be pro-Israel are those who call themselves born again. And so that factor, the Pat Robertson crowd, very heavily organized since 1988. Since 1988, and actually when polling was done in the 80s, you found that even among that born-again community, those who identified themselves as such, did not have an articulated view on Middle East issues. It is more recent that they are playing that kind of role. And so, to some extent, you're finding members of Congress taking positions on the Republican side that they wouldn't have taken before. The old image of the Republican Party as protecting U.S. interests and U.S. investment and having, more balanced attitude toward the Middle East has changed, in part because of this factor. This and what I call the neoconservative hardliners, who at the end of the Cold War still need a Cold War enemy, and have reached out and found Islam and Arab states, and still, interestingly enough, in the rhetoric used, if you look at the Republican Party platforms over the last several years, still are using the language that they used during the Cold War to describe both the role of Israel, but also to describe their feeling about the Arab states. They still see it in that geopolitical struggle. And I think that that is a factor as well to account for some of the difference here in language. But I would believe that if, for example, George W. Bush were elected president, that there would be a continuity of some of the very basic principles that have guided the peace process up till now. Yes?
If the candidates have recognized the Arab American community as a constituency, how do you explain the candidates' less than balanced positions as they've been articulated so far? I mean, positions which you don't find very sympathetic to the Arab American community.
Well, we've had this year, for the first time, 2 presidential candidates address our community. That never happened before. We did have the president come to us a year ago. That was the first time a president has spoken before an Arab American audience. We have a number of campaigns that have formed Arab American support committees. And the campaigns have reached out to Arab Americans, some of them, a number of them actually, for help in framing positions, not only on foreign policy issues, but on domestic policy issues as well. We've had contact, yes, with at least 4 of the major campaigns, the McCain and Bush campaign on the Republican side, and with the campaigns of Bill Bradley and Vice President Al Gore.
Did you?
Yes, and not me personally, some have, but have significant Arab American involvement in their campaigns. The engagement of Arab Americans in the policy debate is a new factor, and it has been an important one for our community. We find some more responsive than others. I'm not going to get into that now, but I think that the fact that this occurs is a new development, and we're really pleased with that. Yeah?
How much consensus is there within the Arab American community when they articulate, what they would like to see presidential candidates' positions be?
Well, we actually have just completed a poll on that, and we'll be releasing that next week at a press conference on the 28th, and I'll welcome you all back then. We'll talk about the role of Arab Americans in the campaigns and what we're doing. I'm actually going to be in Iowa this weekend. We have a large Arab American community in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, something that isn't well known about. Bill Bradley visited with them, and we have promised that other candidates will be there before the end of the week. We also have Arab American involvement in the campaigns in New Hampshire, etc. So there is a lot of involvement here. With regard to the positions that the community takes, there are a number of consensus questions. They're not consensus questions with regard to party or with regard even to candidate. But there are some consensus positions. They support a Palestinian state. They support a peace process that is a balanced one. They support the security of Israel and a secure Palestinian state, and they want Lebanon to be free and in control of all of its territory. They want Jerusalem. They support protecting Arab rights in the city of Jerusalem. They want a more balanced policy with regard to human rights and democracy in the whole Middle East. On domestic issues, there's concern about immigration. There's concern about the issue of discrimination, but there also are a number of positions which we'll get into next week on some of the what are called the social issues. Arab Americans have a more conservative social agenda, like many other recent ethnic communities, and so it's an interesting, complex community that leans somewhat Democratic, but also is a swing vote community on several issues, and we'll talk more about that when we release the complete poll. Yes?
When you say that U.S. policy has been consistent during Democratic and Republican administrations, do you mean that practically speaking, there is no real difference between the Democrats and Republicans at the White House?
I think that it's really quite fascinating to look at the conduct of policy during the Bush administration and the conduct of policy toward the peace process during the Clinton administration, and you try to discern the differences. The one difference is that the president said, Bill Clinton said when he was running for office, his one difference with George Bush was, he said, he would have his differences, but he would not articulate them in public. And he has been true to that. But what he has found are some very clever, subtle, but very real ways of letting a government in Israel know when he was displeased with them without ever articulating it in public. I mean, your plane sitting on the same tarmac as the plane of the prime minister of the other country and not meeting with him, flying back to Washington, and a couple of days later finding a full mourning and then some to host the last prime minister and the wife of an assassinated former prime minister for the awarding of a peace prize, where he talked at great length about the role of peace and about the commitment of the previous governments to peace. I think everyone in Israel got the message. He had a more subtle way of sending the very same message that the Bush and Baker team sent in the years that they managed the peace process. And so I think that there has been a remarkable consistency in the way that this process has been maintained.
It's going to be the the same, in your opinion, with whoever comes to the White House next year?
May not be. There are some views, and that's why I think we need to have a far more developed debate on these issues. I think America has an interest in how this process is conducted. I think we have an interest in whether or not we're going to have somebody as president who's going to go get them, whatever that means in Iraq. I don't know. And I think that when candidates say things, they ought to be held accountable for the things that they say. When they say they're going to move the embassy to East Jerusalem, I want to know if he really knows what he meant when he said that. Does he know what impact that would have? When Republicans in Congress pass legislation that requires the move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, one, and then establishes as the catch that if you don't move the embassy by a date certain, we will suspend your overseas construction budget or portions of it, the purpose of that budget being to provide security for Americans in embassies abroad, I think somebody ought to be asking that question. And when the guy who was the architect of that policy runs for president in 1996, someone ought to say, Bob Dole, why did you change your position as dramatically as you did? They would have asked him that question if it were a change on ethanol. They would ask them that question if it were a change with regard to free trade with China. But when he is putting American lives at risk by threatening to suspend the budget for overseas embassy construction and mandating a move that would at best be described as provocative, somebody ought to ask the question, what's up? What are you doing? What are you thinking about here? And yet that question didn't occur. No one asked it. No one asked it throughout the entire 1996 presidential debate. And so I think that, you know, they owe it to us, they owe it to themselves as leaders to be as explicit in describing how and answering the questions of how they would deal with these critical life and death questions. Again, I repeat, since the end of the Vietnam War, in the Middle East, we have sent more money, sent more troops, sent more weapons, lost more lives, been engaged in more battles there than anywhere else in the world. And yet the limited amount of public discussion we have about that, and the free pass we give to members of Congress when they pursue some of the bizarre programs that they pursue, is inexcusable. And part of it is to do with the lack of scrutiny in the press. And I think it's critical to do. That's why we're doing the study now and asking for more. Yeah.
James, you say they have a responsibility, but do you think maybe they just don't know? They just are ignorant. They don't have any positions yet. It's too early in the campaign. It's not an issue. It's not like, you know, something that necessarily speaks to the constituencies in New Hampshire and Iowa, and that's why they haven't focused on it yet. And I mean, maybe it's a little premature.
I would suggest to you that involvement on the Middle East, in the Middle East, is at least as critical a question in terms of American investment, American interests, and what's at risk, as policy towards China and policy towards Russia, at least. And interestingly enough, in public opinion polling we've done, when we asked people to compare the importance of U.S. involvement in a number of foreign policy questions, the only one that comes out higher than the Middle East is drugs from Central America, is the response of candidates to that issue. Middle East comes out as high as China, and higher than the issue of the stability of Russia. That's according to public opinion. Tell me New Hampshire voters are different? I don't think so. Tell me Iowa voters are different? I don't think so. In 1992, we took a plank, as we did in 1988, on Middle East peace, calling for a Palestinian state and a security for the state of Israel, a balanced peace, to Iowa. Passed it every single caucus we went into. Every single one. Passed it at the state level. Iowa voters can care about foreign policy issues. The candidates do not treat them respectfully, and I maintain that when asked questions by the press, the follow-up and the scrutiny that it ought to be given the next day is not always there. And I would say to you that, as someone concerned as I am about this issue, concerned from the perspective of the Jewish community and concerned at the question of the Arab American community, whether or not we give these guys a free ride is something that we ought to be thinking about. Shouldn't they be held to a standard at least equal to the standard that they are held to with regard to their policies on China or on ethanol or on any other issue that's out there, all of which I grant you are important? This one's important too. The president this week isn't dealing with ethanol. The president this week is dealing with the imminent collapse of the peace process. The amount of time we spend on it, the investment that our presidents have to give in time and energy and political capital to this issue is too great for us to continue to ignore it as a question of debate. These guys are going to school right now. Let's make sure the education is across the board and they pass an examination on the Middle East as well as on other issues, because that's what they're going to be doing. That's what they're going to be doing over the next 4 years. Any other questions? Yeah.
Same question I asked about Bradley and Gore. What differences do you see in the Bush and McCain positions in the Middle East?
John McCain is characteristically quite frank, as he is on a number of other issues. I mean, when one describes John McCain, the first word that seems to occur these days is how frank he is on a number of issues. He took on all comers when he spoke to our conference and answered questions right and left. I thought, in some instances, rather facilely. I believe that if there were a case to be made for scrutiny, the McCain campaign would be one. His views on the Middle East require, I think, much greater development than kind of off-the-cuff responses, the kind that have been given up till now. Now, in the case of George Bush, we've had the same problem with the Bush campaign that virtually everybody else has had, and that is trying to get detailed position papers on issues. Didn't respond to the Vote Smart survey, didn't respond to a whole bunch of other surveys, and hasn't responded to many questionnaires submitted to the campaign on issues up till now. And so what we have to work with is anecdotal evidence of comments made before a variety of audiences and or the repudiation of those comments by spokespersons the next day. With regard to the issue of Jerusalem, for example, it appeared that the instinct of the candidate was to say, I wouldn't do anything to screw up the peace process. He said that on a couple of occasions. Spokesperson comes out a couple of days later and says, no, what he really meant was he would move it as soon as he's in office. At one point in another off-the-cuff comment, he apparently said to a reporter that, yes, he would move the embassy. So I think that here, too, greater development is required, and the press ought to be asking some serious questions, and has not up till now. Both candidates have gotten a free ride.
One of the indicators to the position of any candidate is the team of advisors working with him on the issues. If we take this as a way to judge the position of any of them, what do you think about the main candidates?
Well, we have been taking a look at that, and I am concerned with the presence of some of the neoconservative hardliners who are involved in some of the campaigns. But I'll tell you that the role of these advisors is not always what it's cut out to be. Sometimes they are there in a campaign as a message to a certain constituency. This one's on my team, that one's on my team, i.e., support me because that's one of your guys. So I'm not going to use the presence of certain individuals in the campaigns as a measure of the policies that they will ultimately put forward. The appointments that they make when they're in, that's an issue. But some of the role that these advisors play is more symbolic than it is substantive, and I'm not in a position right now to judge them based on symbolism. Yeah.
Can you name some of the advisors you're concerned about?
No. No, I say neoconservative hardliners and leave it as that. I'll mention one person because I'd publicly criticized before. I think that, when Richard Pearl was advising the Netanyahu campaign and the Dole campaign at the same time, somebody's eyebrow should have gone up. Not advising him as a gun for hire, as in the campaign manager, let me design your TV ads, but advising on substance and on policy. I think that is an issue of concern. especially when we begin to see some of the same kind of formulations emerge. It's something that I think is worth looking at.
Anyone with the Democrats?
No, again, I'm not going to get into the names. I've spoken about the Pearl one before.
About anybody with the Democrats?
No, I mean, I'm not concerned about anybody on either side, actually. I mean, I think that there are some names, but whether or not that is a decisive question, I think is something else. I can question the judgment of people to advise campaigns in two entirely different countries. I think that that's something worth looking at. But with regard to playing the game of looking at the symbolism of why X was appointed as opposed to Henry Kissinger's advising a bunch of campaigns. I'm not going to get into that. The message that's sent is wise person from previous administrations is helping us. That's the message. And I've been involved in presidential campaigns enough to know that the role of advisors is always balanced by other advisors, and so the message is one of symbolism more than it is of direct content. Yes?
The paper is really critical, very critical of the media. Don't you believe that this is a factor that is a kind of function of the public opinion in general? The media reflects what they believe is the public opinion attitude towards the Middle East?
I don't think that the media does reflect what public opinion thinks about a whole lot of issues. If it had, the obsession over the White House scandals and the treatment of it by the media, the all scandal all the time that actually gave birth to a couple of networks that were pretty much limited to a crowd of people here in Washington who liked that sort of stuff. No, I don't think that the media reflects what the broader public opinion is thinking necessarily at all. And neither do, in many cases, like I said, the candidates. If you look at the position, we did a poll in New York. We asked voters in New York. This was the issue that we were being told when Mrs. Clinton came back from the Middle East. It was going to kill her. It was going to hurt her campaign badly. And so we asked we asked in a poll in New York, do you think your next senator should be pro-Israel, pro-Arab, or strike a balance between the two? Almost 80% of New Yorkers said we want our next senator to strike a balance between the two. Well, does that explain the New York Post headlines? I think not. Does it explain the obsession that the paper had with whether Hillary did this or that right or wrong? I think not. I don't think that enough attention is paid to really where public opinion is on these issues, or the gap that exists between public opinion and where people are on these issues. And I'll tell you, if more attention were paid, I think that the amount of alienation that we have, the cynicism that we have of what is called politics as usual, would be a whole lot less. Be a whole lot less. There is not, I think, sufficient attention paid to where voters really are and what their real concerns are. And I think that that is one of the concerns that we have in this study.
If I may follow up, you may be right when it comes to positions. Maybe the media do not reflect the positions of the public opinion when it comes to the Middle East and other foreign policy issues. But what I claim is that it reflects, one way or the other, the attitude, the general attitude of caring about the Middle East or not caring about it. What I believe is that the media gives the space that is almost proportionate to what the public opinion believes in the Middle East. Not positions. The general attitude of the public opinion in this country towards the Middle East is not that keen.
I think not. I think not. I think that if you look especially over the last 7 years at the near obsession with Middle East issues, from Iraq to the peace process, we've given the various peace talks the same coverage as OJ. They were given nonstop live treatment wherever they took place in the world. The event itself is covered. The event itself is covered with the intensity that it requires because the media knows what's at stake. What is not covered is the debate that ought to be taking place among the candidates about what they will do when they are trying to shepherd the peace talks in the next 4 years. What's not covered is what the candidates would do with regard to the continuing nagging problem of Iraq and Gulf security and treatment of our allies in the region. That is not covered. What is not covered are bizarre statements made by candidates to pander to a particular audience that are not looked at for what they would be if they were translated into policy. That is not covered. But the events themselves are covered. And friends of mine on the pro-Israel side of this equation are concerned that there's way too much coverage in the media about Middle East issues. The events themselves are covered. The policy debate is not covered or is not scrutinized as I believe it ought to be. And so the purpose of our study is to provoke precisely such a debate. People ought to be asking the questions, where will you lead us in the next 4 years? How will you spend our assets? We have a debate right now with regard to the Syria-Israel thing. We're talking astronomical numbers of billions of dollars to secure this agreement. I would suggest to you that the time to talk about it is now, not to wait until after the election occurs. How valuable is Middle East peace? And what are we willing to pay? I think American voters would make the right choice if we were given the option to talk about it. And so I suggest to you that on all of the issues that will require our wealth, that will require our lives, that will require our prestige, that will require our investment as a country to protect our interests, our security and strategic interests in that region, we have to be having a discussion. And so I will leave you with that, and I thank you very much for your attention. We'll be back next week with a treatment on the other issues, the role that Arab Americans are playing in the presidential campaign. Thank you.
Jim, you were exaggerating, or were you saying talks around imminent collapse?